The mountains had a way of keeping their distance from the rest of the world. They rose high and silent, pine-covered and cold, as if they wanted nothing to do with men or their problems. Dax Wilder had chosen them for exactly that reason. For 5 years, he had lived alone in a small log cabin, nestled into the timberline nearly a mile above the nearest trail. No town lights reached him here, no church bells, no voices calling his name, just the wind through the trees and the steady work of surviving one day at a time. Dax was 30 years old, but his face looked older. The lines around his eyes were carved there by loss, not time. He was Apache by blood and something else by circumstance, raised among white men, hardened by their ways, and finally discarded by them when ambition outgrew loyalty. Once he had been a bounty hunter, a damn good one. He tracked men for money, collected debts for the gambling halls, and lied when lies paid better than truth. He did it alongside a small crew men who trusted each other with their lives. Among them was Cale Draycott, his closest friend, the man who had shared his fire, his whiskey, and his secrets. Dax had believed in him. That belief had cost him everything. The night his wife died, Dax wasn't there. He'd been sent out on a job, an easy one, Cale said, just to delay a few extra hours away from town. While Dax was gone, the casino where his wife worked the books was robbed. Shots were fired, men ran. By the time Dax returned, the blood had already soaked into the floorboards. At first it looked like bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time. Later Dax learned the truth. The robbery had been staged. The men were hired. The timing was arranged so Dax wouldn't be there. His wife's death wasn't a mistake, it was an acceptable loss. Cale needed Dax out of the way. He needed to climb higher to become the man in charge. Dax never confronted him. He didn't kill him. He didn't run to the law. He simply walked away. From the job, from the town, from every man who had ever called him brother. He came up into the mountains and stayed. On the morning everything changed again. Dax had gone out early to hunt. Snow dusted the ground in thin patches, just enough to hold tracks. He moved slow and quiet, rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes always scanning. Hunger had a way of sharpening attention. Near the edge of a clearing, not far from an old horse corral that hadn't been used in years, he saw something that didn't belong. Footprints, not animal. Human, small, uneven. They cut across the frozen dirt and veered toward the corral. Dax crouched and studied them. The stride was short, dragging. Whoever it was had been favoring one leg. There were dark spots in the soil blood. He followed the trail, every instinct alert now. The corral leaned inward with age, its boards gray and splintered. The gate hanging crooked on one hinge. Inside, the smell of old hay and rot lingered. Dax stepped carefully, boots silent, on packed earth. That was when he saw her. She was pressed against the far wall, half hidden behind a pile of straw. A young woman, awake but barely. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale with exhaustion. Her dress was torn at the hem and darkened with blood. Dax's first thought was simple and immediate. She was badly hurt. He moved closer, knelt, and spoke low. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." She looked at him with dark, unfocused eyes. Fear was there, but so was something else, resolve. She didn't scream, didn't try to run. She didn't have the strength. The blood on her skirt worried him. Too much of it. If she was bleeding internally, she wouldn't last long. "Where are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head weakly, trying to say something, but her voice failed. Dax acted on instinct. He reached for the hem of her skirt, lifting it just enough to look for a wound. Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. "Please," she whispered, hoarse and embarrassed. "Stop." Dax froze. Her eyes filled with tears, not from pain, but from shame. She turned her face away and managed to say, "I'm bleeding because I'm a woman." Understanding hit him all at once. Dax pulled his hand back, immediately standing up so fast he nearly stumbled. He turned his back to her. Hate crept up his neck despite the cold air. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't know." A long, heavy silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind howling against the worn boards of the cabin. After a moment, she spoke again. "My legs hurt," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't walk much farther," she added, her breath shallow. Dax Wilder nodded without looking at her, his focus instead on the ground before him. He crouched, taking stock of the situation, trying to remain composed. Her ankle was swollen, the boot torn. He could see that much without crossing any lines. "Can you stand?" he asked quietly. She tried, but her body trembled. She slumped back against the wall, gasping for air. Then, with a look of determination, she met his gaze and said the words that changed everything. "Please," she pleaded, her voice cracked. "If I stay here, I'll die. I need help." Dax closed his eyes, the weight of the moment settling into his chest. For years, he'd lived by one rule: don't get involved. Don't save anyone. Don't become responsible for another life. He had already failed once, and that failure haunted him in his dreams. But this woman wasn't asking for grand heroics. She wasn't asking him to fight or lie or kill. She was simply asking him not to walk away. Dax turned back to her, his heart pounding as he studied her face, young, exhausted, and yet stubbornly alive. His mind flashed to his wife, to that night he hadn't been there, to the choice he'd made to survive rather than stay. "If you stay here," he said slowly, "you won't make it through the night." She swallowed hard, then asked, "And if I go with you?" He hesitated, the weight of his promise pressing on him. "You might live." That was the best he could offer. Dax knelt in front of her, his back to her. "I'm going to lift you," he said, his voice steady. "Hold on if you can." She did, clutching at his shoulders as he stood, her fragile weight resting on him. He carried her out of the corral, back into the woods, away from the place where she'd surely die alone. Behind them, the footprints were slowly covered by the drifting snow, as if the mountain itself was trying to forget they'd ever been there. Dax didn't look back. For the first time in 5 years, he chose not to walk away. He carried her the last half-mile through timber and snow, his breath coming steady despite the weight on his shoulders. The path rose gently toward his cabin, the ground uneven, the trees thick enough to block most of the wind. She clung to him in silence, her jaw clenched, refusing to cry out, even when her injured ankle sent pain shooting through her leg. The cabin came into view, just as plain and weather-beaten as always, built more for survival than comfort, with pine logs stacked tight. A stone chimney rising from the roof and a sagging porch that reminded any man who saw it that time never stood still. Dax pushed the door open with his shoulder, stepping inside. The warmth from the fire he'd banked that morning greeted him. He laid her down on the narrow bed near the hearth and stepped back at once, giving her space. He could see the paleness of her face, the exhaustion in her eyes. Survival had drained her. "I'll get water," he said quietly. She nodded, her eyes half closed. Dax moved quickly, boiling water on the stove, pulling blankets from a chest. He stirred the fire until it breathed again, then set the water by her side. He turned away, unsure where to put his hands, where to look. He'd been alone too long. There were things he knew how to do: hunt, track, kill if needed. But this was different. When he returned to her side, she spoke softly. "I'm sorry about earlier." Dax shook his head. "No need." A long silence stretched between them. I don't have what I need," she said carefully, choosing her words with care. "I can't take care of myself right now." Dax understood what she meant. The realization settled like a stone in his chest. He looked at the floor, then toward the door. "There's a woman," he said after a long pause. "Lives about a quarter-mile down the ridge. An old widow. If she's home, she might help." Relief crossed her face, followed by something that looked like gratitude. "Thank you." Dax grabbed his coat and stepped back into the cold. The sky had darkened, snow threatening again. He reached the widow's cabin in minutes, knocking once, then again. The door opened to a woman, well past 70, her hair white and braided down her back, eyes sharp as a hawk's. She looked at Dax, then raised an eyebrow. "What trouble you bringing me today, boy?" "There's a young woman hurt," he said simply. "I don't know how to help her properly." The old woman studied him for a long moment, then grabbed her shawl and stepped outside without a word. Dax opened the door and stepped aside, letting her go first. She glanced at the woman on the bed, nodding to herself. "Out," she said to Dax. Dax Wilder didn't argue. He stepped onto the porch and shut the door behind him. The wood creaked under his boots as he paced once, then stopped. He leaned against the post, staring out at the darkened trees, his mind heavy. Embarrassment pressed on him like a weight, the kind of feeling that made him feel young again, vulnerable, foolish. Not the mountain ghost he'd become. Inside, low voices murmured the sound of water flowing, the rustle of fabric. Dax turned his focus back to the ridgeline, counting breaths, counting the years he'd spent avoiding moments like this. After a long while, the door creaked open. Bess Calloway stepped out, pulling her shawl tight around her. "She'll be fine," she said. "Needs rest, food, and that ankle kept still." Dax nodded, barely meeting her eyes. "Thank you." She looked at him more closely now. "You did right, asking for help. I didn't know what else to do." "That's how you know it was the right thing," she replied, before turning and walking back down the trail. Dax waited a few more minutes before heading back inside. The cabin felt different now, softer somehow. Ivy Hawk lay in bed, cleaner, more at ease beneath the blankets. Faint color had returned to her cheeks. She met his gaze when he entered. "Thank you," she said again. He placed a bowl of thin porridge on the table and carried it over to her. "Eat slow," she did. Later, as the fire burned low and the wind howled outside, she spoke again. "I should tell you why I was running." Dax didn't answer right away. He added another log to the fire and sat in a chair by the window waiting. "I was with someone," she said quietly. "A powerful man, a leader among bounty hunters." Dax's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "I loved him," she continued, her voice faltering. "Or I thought I did. I learned things I wasn't supposed to know." She paused, her eyes on her hands. "About men he'd sold out. About people who disappeared. When I tried to leave, he locked me away." "I escaped," she said, swallowing hard. "If he finds me, I won't live." She never mentioned his name. Dax didn't ask for it. His mind flashed to Cale Draycott, to ambition, dressed up as loyalty, to how easily men convinced themselves that power made them right. "You can stay here," Dax said, his voice steady. "As long as you need." Her eyes lifted, searching his face. "Why would you do that?" He looked at the fire, then replied, "Because I didn't before." That night she slept deeply, exhaustion finally claiming her. Dax sat by the window until the moon rose and set behind the trees. The bottle of whiskey stayed unopened on the shelf. Outside, the mountains held their silence. And under that quiet roof, two strangers rested, each carrying secrets, each learning in their own way how to trust again. Time moved differently in the high country. Days didn't rush. They unfolded. The morning light crept across the floorboards long before the sun cleared the ridge, and the evening settled in like a long breath let out. Dax found himself measuring the weeks. Not by dates, but by small changes, how steady Ivy's step had become, how the snow thinned along the south-facing slope, how the cabin sounded less hollow at night. Her ankle healed slowly but steadily. Dax fashioned a splint from juniper and rawhide, tightening it just enough to hold but not so tight as to cut off circulation. He showed her how to lean on a walking stick, how to test the ground before trusting it. She learned quickly. Pride helped. They settled into a kind of rhythm, though neither of them named it. Mornings began with water on the stove and the soft scrape of iron on stone as Dax sharpened tools. She swept the floor with a broom made of willow twigs, careful not to put too much weight on her bad leg. He kept his distance when she dressed, and she never made him feel foolish for it. Respect was offered as a way of growing. One morning, she tried to cook. Dax was outside splitting kindling when he smelled smoke. Not the warm, friendly scent of a fire breathing right, but the sharp bite of something burning that shouldn't. He burst through the door, heart hammering, and flung water toward the stove. It splashed wide, too wide. She yelped, soaked to the bone, eyes wide as saucers. Then to his surprise, she laughed a real laugh, unguarded, surprised. "I thought the cabin was going up," he said, mortified. She pushed the wet hair from her face, still chuckling. "Well, at least now I know how to get your attention." It was just the pot. The pot he saw was scorched black and ruined beyond saving. They stood there, dripping wet, staring at each other. Then Dax Wilder laughed too. It started off quiet, but soon grew louder than he intended. The sound felt strange in his chest, like stretching a muscle that hadn't been used in a long while. Later that week, Ivy decided his coat needed mending. Dax's winter coat had been patched and repatched, seams as thick as scars. She sat by the window needle, flashing in the low light, her tongue caught between her teeth. When she handed it back to him, he slipped it on without thinking. The coat tore clean down the seam as he moved his arm. Ivy stared at the rip, and Dax stared at the ceiling. "I may have missed you," Ivy said carefully. He shrugged. "Happens." They fixed it together. Her needle moving slower this time, his hands steady, holding the cloth in place. It took longer, but it held. As the days warmed, Dax pointed out a strip of land behind the cabin where the snow melted first. "Ground's thin," he said, "but it'll grow." They cleared rocks and roots, worked the soil with a borrowed hoe until their backs ached. Dax measured seeds into the dirt, beans, onions, squash, covering them like they were something precious. "It doesn't look like much," she said. "It will," he answered. The garden became a quiet promise. Each morning they checked for signs of life, and when the first green shoots broke through, Ivy clapped her hands once soft and quick, as if she didn't want to scare it away. Dax noticed things he hadn't expected to notice. How she hummed while sweeping. How she spoke to the kettle as if it were stubborn but well-meaning. How the cabin no longer felt like a place built to endure, but one learning how to live. He drank less without meaning to. The bottle stayed where it was because he didn't reach for it. Nights passed without the old ache pulling him toward it. Sometimes Ivy asked about the mountains where the elk crossed, where the creek ran deepest, how far the nearest town was. He answered what he could, careful not to offer more than she asked. He never spoke of his past, unless it pressed its way out. Once as the light faded, and the fire burned low, he mentioned his wife. Just one sentence, no details. She liked mornings, he said they gave a person another chance. She didn't ask what had happened. She just nodded as if she understood something words would spoil. Then the letter came. It arrived folded tight, tucked beneath a stone at the edge of the clearing, where a man had demeaned to leave it. No name, no seal. Just a place and time written in a hand that knew how to be neat without being careful. Ivy held it like it might bite. Dax read it once, then again. The location named an abandoned house on the south slope, about 3 miles out. A place hunters avoided because the roof sagged, and the ground fell away behind it in a long, unforgiving drop. "They found me," Ivy said quietly. Dax watched the fire, his gaze distant. "Looks that way. They want to finish it." He folded the letter and set it on the table. The room felt smaller now, like the walls had edged closer to listen. Ivy waited, not pleading, not arguing, just waiting. Dax stood and went to the door. The night was clear, the stars sharp enough to cut. He thought of the day he'd walked away from everything. How easy it had been to tell himself it was the only choice. He thought of the garden the green shoots pushing up through stubborn ground. "I won't run anymore," he said. She let out a breath she'd been holding for too long. They didn't speak of plans that night. They cleaned the dishes, banked the fire, and went to their separate corners of the cabin. Sleep came slow, but it came. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, carrying the smell of earth waking up. The garden waited. The mountains watched, and in the quiet between heartbeats, ordinary days took on the weight of something worth protecting. They left before dawn. Dax woke to a sky the color of old iron, the kind that promised clear weather and hard light. He banked the fire low, packed what little they would need: water-dried venison, a coil of rope, his rifle, and a handful of cartridges. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The decision had already been made the night before, and there was no sense in arguing with a choice once it had settled. Ivy watched him from the table, her hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. Her ankle was better now, still tender but strong enough to carry weight. She had bound herself tight, her movements practiced and quiet. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice firm but not pleading, just stating a truth he already knew. "I know," Dax Wilder replied. They stepped outside as the first rays of sunlight sliced across the ridge. The mountains stood still, patient, and the air bit at their lungs. Dax locked the cabin door out of habit, then paused. He hadn't locked it in years. The trail ahead led south, winding through timber and rock. They walked single file, Dax ahead, setting a pace that didn't push her too hard. Every so often he slowed without explanation. He had learned to listen to the land, and the land had a way of speaking if a man paid attention. After a mile, Ivy spoke. "They threatened my family," she said, her voice steady. "My parents, my younger brother. They're still in Mexico," she added. Dax nodded, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "You have proof?" "Yes." She tapped the satchel at her side. "Names, places, deals. Enough to ruin them if it ever sees daylight. And enough to get you killed if it doesn't," Dax said. She didn't argue. They reached the south slope just as the sun cleared the peaks. The abandoned house stood crooked against the incline. Its boards were bleached and cracked windows, dark and empty. Behind it, the ground fell away, sharply scattered with rocks and scrub that would tear a body apart long before it reached the bottom. Dax studied the place through the trees. They picked it for a reason. Ivy swallowed. "I know." Dax signaled for her to stay back and circled wide, checking the ground, the wind and the angles of approach. No birds, no movement, too quiet. "Stay close," he said when he returned. "And if I tell you to run, don't argue." She met his eyes. "I won't." They stepped into the open together. The voice came from the house, smooth and amused. "Well, you made it." Dax recognized it the moment it carried across the yard. The cadence, the confidence of men who never had to pay for their choices. Cale Draycott stepped out from the doorway, flanked by two men Dax didn't recognize. He was broader now, heavier around the middle, but still trim and neat. Power suited him. Cale's gaze slid from Dax to Ivy, then back again. A slow smile spread across his face, not quite pleased, more assessing. "So this is how it ends," Cale said. "You bring my girl to me." Ivy stiffened. "I'm not yours." Cale laughed. "You were." He turned to Dax. "Did you know she ran?" Because she was scared, Dax stayed silent. "She ran because she knew too much," Ivy said, her voice steady. "And because you locked me in a room when I tried to leave." Cale shrugged. "Protection." "That's not protection," Dax said quietly. "That's a cage." Cale's smile thinned. "Funny, coming from you. I thought you didn't care anymore." Dax stepped forward. "I thought I didn't either." The air between them tightened. One of Cale's men shifted, reaching for his belt. Ivy spoke, then her voice clear and unafraid. "I loved you," she said to Cale, "until I learned what you were." Cale's eyes hardened. "You don't get to judge me." She does, Dax said. So do I. Kale sighed like a man disappointed by the weather. You always were soft, Dax. That's why I had to move you aside. The words landed exactly as intended. Dax's grip tightened on his rifle. He saw it all again. The empty casino floor, the blood on the boards, the way the truth came too late to matter. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate. You set it up, didn't you? Kale. You knew I wouldn't be there. Kale didn't deny it. Business. The fight came fast after that. One of Kale's men lunged. Dax fired once, the shot cracking sharply in the cold air. The man dropped. The other one broke and ran scrambling toward the trees. Kale drew his knife. The distance between them closed quickly. Years of shared history collapsed into a single violent moment. They grappled boots, slipping on the dirt and stone. Kale Draycott was strong, but Dax Wilder was steady, grounded by something heavier than anger. They broke apart near the edge. You could have been something, Kale spat. You could have ruled with me. Dax drove forward, forcing him back. I'm done taking orders. Kale stumbled, his heel slipping. Dax stopped inches from him. This is for her, Dax said, and for my wife. Kale laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. Then the ground took him. The sound echoed down the slope and vanished. Silence flooded the space left behind. Dax stood there, breathing hard. The world narrowed to the pounding of his heart. Then he turned. Ivy was watching him, her face pale but resolute. He expected fear. Instead, he saw relief tempered with sorrow. It's over, she said. Dax nodded. For him. They didn't linger. The house had nothing left to say. The walk back was slower, heavier. The mountains looked the same, but Dax felt the weight shift like a burden finally set down. When the cabin came into view, the garden caught the light, small, green, stubborn. Dax unlocked the door and held it open. Ivy stepped inside, safe for the moment. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the echoes of choices made and debts paid. The past had found them, as it always did. But it hadn't won. They didn't speak on the way back. The mountains had gone quiet as they did after violence, waiting to see what kind of men survived their own actions. Dax walked ahead, rifle slung low, senses still sharp, though the danger had passed. Behind him, Ivy followed her steps, careful and measured. Like someone afraid to leave too deep a mark, the cabin came into view just as the light softened. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney where the fire still burned beneath the ash. Home, if it could be called that, stood solid and unchanged, as if nothing had happened. As if the world hadn't tilted and righted itself behind them. Dax unbarred the door and stepped aside. Ivy entered first, setting her satchel on the table. He followed, closed the door, and leaned against it for a moment longer than necessary. It was done, he told himself. The man who had shaped so much of his grief lay broken at the bottom of a ravine. The threat had ended. He could finally lay the past to rest. He turned. Ivy was standing near the table, her back to him, shoulders tight. Her hands trembled as she loosened the satchel strap. Are you hurt? He asked. No, she said quickly, too quickly. Dax frowned. Then what is it? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into the satchel and drew out a folded bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She placed it on the table, but didn't open it. These are the papers, she said. The proof. Dax nodded. We'll take them to town when it's safe. She swallowed, her voice heavy with something unspoken. There's more. Something in her voice made Dax's chest tighten. More than what he asked. She turned toward him, then her eyes already filled with the apology, the grief that had nothing to do with Kyle Draycott's death. I wasn't only running, she said, her voice breaking. I was sent. The words didn't hit all at once. They shattered like wood splitting under pressure. Sent, Dax repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. She took a step toward him, then stopped as if an invisible line held her back. He wanted to know where you were, she said. If you were alive. if you were still dangerous. The cabin felt smaller, the walls pressing in. You told me you didn't know who he was, Dax said. I didn't say his name, she replied, her eyes filling with tears. But I knew. Dax shook his head slowly as if that might rearrange the truth into something else. Why, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She reached for the oilcloth, unwrapped it, and revealed a slim knife, well-balanced, familiar to men who made their living ending things. I was supposed to use this, she said, her voice trembling. The weight of the truth hung in the air, pressing against his chest, stealing the breath from his lungs. You were going to kill me, Dax, Wilder said, his voice low and hard. No, Ivy whispered, her voice cracking. I was told to. I couldn't, she added, her hands trembling in her lap. Dax's hands clenched at his sides. Every ordinary day they'd shared rushed back to him, every moment they'd built together. Fragile as glass. The burned pot, the split coat, the garden pushing green through stubborn dirt. He had let himself believe in those things. He had built something fragile atop them. You looked me in the eye, Dax said, his words sharp. You told me you cared. I do, Ivy said, stepping closer despite herself. That part was never a lie. Dax laughed, once sharp and empty. That's the worst kind. Ivy reached for him, but stopped inches away. They threatened my family, she said. If I didn't do what he asked, if I didn't get close to you, they would die. Dax turned away, walking to the window. Outside, the mountains stood indifferent, eternal. He pressed his palm to the glass, grounding himself in something solid. So you were bait, he said, his voice flat. Yes, Ivy whispered. And I was the trap. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't hurt you. I tried to tell myself I could. She said, voice barely a whisper. But every day it became impossible. Dax faced her again. Then why bring the knife back here? Because I needed you to know. She said before I left. The word hit him like a bullet. Left, Dax echoed. You're leaving? He asked, his voice heavy. She nodded again. I can't stay. Not after this. Not after what I almost did. You didn't do it, Dax said. But I would have, Ivy replied softly, if I'd been weaker. Dax closed his eyes. He saw his wife's face as she had been, before the blood, before the silence. Trust once broken never fits together, the same way again. You should go, he said, the words tasting like ash. She flinched. I don't want to. Ivy said, her voice small. I know, Dax replied. That doesn't change what is. She stared at him, searching for something. Permission, forgiveness, a way back. He had none to give. Slowly, deliberately, she walked to the door. Before opening it, she turned back. I never meant to survive by destroying someone else, she said, her voice thick with regret. If there's any truth you keep from this, keep this. What I felt for you was real. Dax didn't answer. Ivy opened the door and stepped out into the fading light. The door closed behind her with a soft, final sound. Dax stood alone in the cabin, the fire crackling in the hearth. The garden waited outside. Everything was as it had been, and nothing was. He picked up the knife from the table and carried it to the door. When he opened it again, Ivy was already halfway down the trail. Dax walked to the edge of the clearing and hurled the knife into the ravine where Cale Draycott had fallen. He listened until the sound faded into nothing. Then he went back inside, shut the door, and sat down. That night the mountains did not answer his silence. 2 years had changed a man. Dax learned that the hard way. The mountains were still there, vast and unbothered, but Dax no longer stayed on the edge of town. He didn't drift into it either. Instead, he settled among the people. Silver Bend wasn't much to look at. One main road, a feed store, a church that leaned a little, and a handful of wooden buildings that smelled of coffee and horse feed. But it was honest, And after years of running from the light, honesty felt like shelter. Dax built his new cabin on a patch of land just outside town, close enough to hear wagon wheels in the morning, but far enough to keep the quiet he still needed. He planted vegetables the way he always had, carefully, patiently. The rows rose straight, the soil turned deep. He sold what he didn't eat, traded when money felt unnecessary. Folks learned his name slowly. They liked him. He fixed fences without being asked. He kept his word. The past didn't vanish. It learned to sit quietly. Some mornings were easier than others. Some mornings he woke with her name already carved into his chest. Other days it stayed still like a scar that only ached when the weather turned. It was one of those mornings, clear sky, cool air. Coffee just poured when the knock came. Dax frowned. No one knocked that early unless something was wrong. He crossed the room, opened the door. A young woman stood on the porch, holding a folded newspaper under her arm. "I've got the morning paper," Ivy said. "Anyone home?" "Home?" Her voice hit Dax Wilder like a sudden blow to the ribs. She looked thinner, stronger. Her hair was tied back, simply no longer the frantic mess it had once been. The sharpness of fear had faded from her eyes, replaced by something steadier, something earned. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she thrust the paper toward him too fast. "Here," she said, "that's all." She turned to leave. Dax stepped forward. "Wait." She stopped, her shoulders stiff. "I didn't know you were here," she said, not turning to face him. "I didn't know you were alive," he answered. That made her turn. They stood there 2 years, stretched between them, filled with all the things neither of them had said. "I'm not who I was," she said quietly. "I know," Dax replied. "Neither am I." She hesitated, then lifted her chin. "I don't stay long. I just deliver the papers." "That's fine," he said. "You don't have to stay." She studied him wary, then nodded once. "Good." She walked away, boots crunching on the gravel. Dax stood there long after she was gone, the paper still in his hand, unread. The next morning she came again. This time she didn't leave right away. The morning after that, she asked about the garden. By the end of the week, they were talking carefully, like people handling something fragile but familiar. She never spoke of bounty hunters. He never spoke of knives or ravines. What mattered now was who they were, not who they'd been forced to be. She told him she'd cut all ties, disappeared the right way, this time changed her name, worked on his jobs, slept without fear. "I couldn't come back until I was clean of it," she said. Dax nodded. He understood the need to earn your own reflection. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the soil, he said, "You don't owe me anything." She paused, dirt on her hands. "I know." "Then why keep coming?" She looked at him. Really looked. "Because I choose to." That mattered. Months passed. Townsfolk noticed. Smiles turned knowing. No one rushed them. People who'd lived hard understood that some things had to come slow. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the hills in gold, Dax set down his hoe. "I don't want what we had before," he said. She stiffened. "Neither do I," she replied. "I want something better," he continued. "Something built with eyes open." She searched his face. "And if the past comes back," she asked. "Then we face it," he said. "Together or not at all." Silence stretched. Then she nodded. They married in the small church on a quiet morning. No finery, no spectacle, just woodlight and the sound of breath taken steady. Townfolk filled the benches. The preacher spoke of forgiveness as labor, not a miracle. When Dax took her hand, it was firm, certain. Years later, people would say the mountain man had finally come home. But Dax knew better. Home wasn't a place you ran back to. It was something you built, piece by piece, with the courage to stay. And this time he stayed. And so their story reminds us that redemption is never sudden. It's built slowly through hard choices, honest work, and the courage to forgive both others and ourselves. In the wide silence of the West, they learned that home is not where you hide, but where you stand and stay. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.